Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Catherine Peer and I'm the Collections Manager and Curator of Social and Military History of the Jewish Museum. I would like to give you a very warm welcome and also give you the regards of the Director of the Jewish Museum, Abigail Morris, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight. Some of you might have seen the Kindertransport exhibition as you came through the Welcome Gallery. After this event, it will be open for another half hour or so. If you want to have a look and haven't had a chance yet, please do. The exhibition shows the personal testimonies of 6 individuals with whom the Jewish Museum has worked in Holocaust education over the years. And so it's a very personal take on this issue and the topic of the Kindertransport. And this event was sort of meant to put things into the wider context. And we're very grateful having 4 high-caliber academics here today to talk to you about it. We'd like to thank them for being here and also thank our partners, the Wiener Library, the Second Generation Network and Pears Institute for having organised this with us. And I would like to pass on the mic to Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Library.
Thank you, Catherine. So just to welcome everybody again. So I'm Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Library. And I also have to apologise that our director, Ben Barker, who was due to be here, can't be here as originally planned. So I just want to have a very brief word about the Wiener Library. Just for anybody that doesn't know, we're in Russell Square with the world's oldest collection of material on the Nazi era and the Holocaust, and we have a busy programme of exhibitions and events, and I hope to see some of you at some of those in future. This particular event came about partly because we have an exhibition currently on Kristallnacht that is running till mid-February. And in conversation with both Leslie Obeck of the Second Generation Network and Catherine, we all thought that it would be good in this 80th anniversary year of various important events such as Kristallnacht and the Kindertransport to hold an event that was not so much commemoration as a reflection on the historical context of these events in terms of what followed and in terms of how these events are remembered. So I hope you find tonight a stimulating evening, and thank you once again to all of the speakers and the Jewish Museum and the Pears Institute and Second Generation Network as well. So enjoy.
And I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and it's a real honour to be able to chair this event this evening and to be able to introduce to you 3 such excellent historians. The great advantage of having an event sponsored by 3 organisations is that when 2 directors can't make it, there's always a 3rd who can step in and chair the thing. Our 3 speakers are Mary Fulbrook, who'll speak first, and then Nick Stargardt, and then Jennifer Craig-Norton. I shall introduce each of them in turn just before they speak. So, first of all, I'll just remind you that the title for our discussion this evening is 1938 in Retrospect, an event to mark the 80th anniversaries of Kristallnacht and the Kindertransport. And as I said, our first speaker is Mary Fulbrook. She'll talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, as will each of our speakers, and then we'll open things up for questions and a wider discussion. Mary is Professor of German History at University College London. Among her many, many publications and renowned publications, in fact, I remember when I was a graduate student hearing Mary talking about Württemberg in the 18th century. So she's moved forward in time from there, has published the Fraenkel prize-winning title, A Small Town Near Auschwitz, Ordinary Nazis and the Holocaust, published in 2012. and this year published a book entitled Reckonings, Legacy of Nazi Persecution and the Quest for Justice. And which will be auctioned off later.
As you can see, it's a quick read.
Thank you very much.
So, Mary.
So to speak for 10 to 15 minutes on the three aspects that we were told this evening was about, how these events unfolded, their historical significance, how we should remember them today. I'm kicking off because I'm talking about the way Kristallnacht was able to take place. I imagine most of you in this room would not be here if you didn't have personal connections to that dreadful past, whether through your own families, whether through friends, relatives, or a sense of belonging to the wider community that was so horrifically persecuted in November 1938. So it's not necessary to go through the historical details, but I want to unpack them just a little bit in terms of the historical debates around how we understand those events and what I think are the significant lessons we might take from that period for today, when we always talk about never again, and yet we still see events taking place. I happened to be in the States a few weeks ago when the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh took place, the Tree of Life synagogue. It's not gone away, and so I think we have to think very, very hard about the kind of society that can prevent radical anti-Semitism spreading and becoming more monstrous as it did in Nazi Germany. So we all know what Kristallnacht was about. It was planned long in advance. Barracks were being built in Buchenwald, for example. Lists were being prepared of Jewish premises, homes, shops that should be attacked. This was all planned long in advance, but we know that the precipitating act was, or the precipitant that was used as the excuse for it, was the assassination of Fulbrook in Paris, who was shot a couple of days earlier, died, and Goebbels took it as the occasion to unleash violence that had been long in the planning. We know that it was primarily carried out by activists. We know that it was the SA, the SS, members of the Hitler Youth who were engaged at the front line. And the Wiener Library has produced an excellent collection of documents where you can just read in horrifying detail place after place after place. I in fact spent quite a bit of yesterday afternoon going through that just to see what there was in the Wiener Library. But it's really depressing reading, one after another eyewitness account of violence, brutality, murder, extreme sadism and lack of humanity. So we know about that. We also know about the beneficiaries, the people who went into the premises, particularly on the afternoon of Thursday the 10th of November, plundering and looting, going in past the smashed shop windows. You've all seen the photos of the smashed-in windows, people just going in and taking what they could. And these Wiener Library accounts and many other accounts talk about the ways in which even children went into jewellers' shops, for example, or watch and clockmaker shops and just took rings and watches and clocks and anything they could lay their hands on, stuffed it in their pockets and ran off. What's interesting, though, is how we understand this. I think what I want to do is lay out for you a couple of historical arguments that have been raging among historians about what kind of society made this possible. And historians have worked extensively. There are very, very many detailed historical analyses of how ordinary Germans responded to this violence unleashed by and carried out by Nazi activists. Some highlight particularly the ways in which people said they were ashamed to be German, David Bankier, for example. Others, Wolfano Krupak, point out that people were critical not only of the destruction of material goods, but also the inhumanity of the rabble, expressing shock that the German state could engage in open terror of this way. Many Germans, including Nazi Party members, saw this as unworthy of the German cultural nation. One historian, even, Dieter Obst, paints a picture in which he finds that large numbers of Germans helped individual Jews in distress, gave them shelter, gave them food, gave them implements for everyday survival, implements of everyday life when their own household goods had been destroyed or stolen. Other historians, however, so that's one side of the historical account. Other historians, however, for example, Alan Steinbeiss, use records of early post-war trials to show the incredibly widespread complicity of ordinary Germans in this violence. It is really quite astonishing how many ordinary Germans were found guilty in very little trials after the war, small trials, found guilty of acts that were criminal acts even under the Nazi regime, in terms of plundering, looting, engaging in violence against property and violence against people. And what's also amazing about these early post-war trials is it shows how many school children were involved in this. Whole classes were bussed in by their teachers to assist in humiliating Jews, at jeering at Jews who'd been arrested and rounded up. So there's enormous complicity in the German public. I think the simple picture that Germans, non-Jewish Germans, Aryan Germans, who are ashamed to be German, has to be really tempered by this evidence of very widespread complicity. Now, going on to how we can understand why most people did nothing. If you were to see somebody out on the street beating up somebody else, you would probably size up the situation quite quickly and think, am I old, frail, weak? Are the gang beating up somebody, tough youngsters? I wouldn't have a hope. I can't do anything. So what I will do is nip round the corner and call the emergency services. I will call the police. You can't do that in Nazi Germany when the police themselves have been instructed not to intervene, when the fire service has been instructed not to put out the fires when the synagogues are set on fire. You cannot call emergency services. But people also generally did not intervene physically and immediately. And what is interesting is that 1938 is different in this respect from 1933. The previous attack on Jewish property, in a sense, April 1933, the boycott of Jewish shops, there is a lot of evidence of ordinary Germans ignoring the boycott, ignoring the SA men standing outside the shops, just going in and making jokes about it, making fun of it, and the boycott was called off because it couldn't be done effectively in face of popular reactions. Didn't mean things got better for Germans. There was, of course, immediately thereafter the so-called law for the restitution of a professional civil service, which booted people out of their jobs. Anyone with even a single Jewish grandparent could no longer take up a professional position. So how is it that things have changed so much by 1938? I just want to raise 2 points to your attention here. One is what I would call beyond anti-Semitism. We rightly worry about anti-Semitism, but I think what is of similar importance, if not of equal importance, is the question of ignorance and indifference, not caring about the victims of anti-Semitic violence. And I think if you explore the ways in which social relations in Germany changed in the preceding years, you can see what I call the social production of ignorance and indifference. Now, this is interesting. German society in the early 1930s, German Jews were highly assimilated, highly integrated. This is not shtetls in Eastern Europe. There is a significant difference in German society. A lot of intermarriage, a lot of so-called Mischlinge, the children of mixed marriages. And what happens in the course of the 30s is twofold. There is an informal process in which people drop their friendships with others who are of Jewish descent. Nothing against you personally, I just can't be your friend anymore. We get this story again and again and again in autobiographical accounts. So Germans of Jewish descent are squeezed out of social circles. They no longer have friendship circles of non-Jewish Germans. And secondly, there are the formal processes, particularly from the Nuremberg laws onwards, which just make it more or less a process of physical, geographical segregation as well as social segregation. For example, the ban on employing an Aryan under the age of 45 in a Jewish household meant in many cases, that Jews who were renting in an apartment block where there were younger cleaners or housekeepers or porters or whatever, had to move out of that apartment block and find another one so that they didn't fall foul of the law. Get many stories like this, that there's a process of informal ghettoisation in effect. So within a few years, many Aryan Germans, I've got scare quotes around that word Aryan all the way through, obviously, because of the nonsense of the racial theory underlying it, but many non-Jewish Germans no longer had much contact, either social or in terms of their living arrangements, or professional, or in leisure clubs, or in sporting associations, or in all sorts of contexts with Germans of Jewish descent. So they no longer knew about their fate in ways in which they had themselves been complicit. They had themselves frozen them out. Alongside that goes what I would call the social production of indifference. A community of empathy is people for whom you feel deeply, for whom you're prepared to take risks. If I saw one of my children being beaten up in the street, even if it was thugs against whom I had no hope whatsoever, I think that I would intervene immediately and try and grab my child or do something. If I saw somebody else's child, I would go around the corner and get out my mobile phone. There is a distinction, even when it's easy for us, and much more so when it's not easy. There's, however, a second thing going on, which I call the social production of passivity. Even if you're not indifferent, even if you care deeply, why do you not act? And here I think there are processes of growing apathy and fear and resignation. You can see this in autobiographical accounts of non-Jewish Germans who talk about how by the mid-1930s they were just conforming, they were behaving, they were going along with the crowd. It was easier to do Heil Hitler and mutter something else to pretend they weren't really doing Heil Hitler. Conformity, and then they start getting a guilty conscience. They start feeling uneasy about what they're doing, and then they start feeling resigned, and then they think, well, tough is all too difficult, I can't do anything anyway. I don't want to make inappropriate comparisons, so I'm not suggesting that living in Trump's America or Brexit Britain is in any way comparable, but there is a sense at which you begin to feel you've heard enough about it and you can't personally do anything to affect it and just leave it for that rabble up there to get on with it. And I think there is a far worse process of that going on in mid-1930s Germany, backed up by knowledge of the concentration camps and the Gestapo and the SS, the very real presence of terror for those who had attempted to do something against the regime and could not any longer. So there is this growth of passivity. So when we come to November 1938, there are many different possible behavioural choices. And the most prevalent one, I think, was unhappy passivity, not intervening. You do, however, get some very odd things coming through the documents. I've read a lot of autobiographical accounts. I'm writing a book about bystanders at the moment, which I've been reading these, and it's quite interesting that many of those who managed to survive and emigrate were helped by even police officers, SS officers, Nazi relatives, a Nazi brother-in-law, a Nazi uncle married to a Jewish aunt. You know, there were many odd helpers in odd places, so there is still a sense of humanity going on. So helpers and rescuers, but not interveners. Now, what is the longer-term significance of Kristallnacht? What is its historical significance? I think it's quite clear, it's absolutely clear, that those who emigrated earlier, like my mother, incidentally, who emigrated in the mid-30s, were looking for better prospects for a future life. Those who left after Kristallnacht were simply trying to cling on to any prospect of life at all. It was clear that this was effectively the end. So it is a massive turning point in perceptions of Nazi policies towards German Jews and Austrian Jews, of course, for whom it had been extremely violent a few months since the Anschluss. It's a quite different dynamic going on in Austria at that point. So, massive wave of emigration. My eldest half-brother, in fact, was brought out at the age of 3 in January 39 after his grandfather had had a spell in Sachsenhausen. After Kristallnacht, his grandfather brought him across, then went back for the rest of the family and didn't manage to do anything. I mean, that was the end of him, basically. But my eldest brother, my half-brother, would not be here were it not for that. So a massive moment of historical significance. How should we remember it today? How should we remember it today? I think there are a couple of things of interest to note here. One is that when you look at oral history accounts that are done in the 1990s and 2000s, most Germans who were young people at the time of Kristallnacht and are elderly, middle-aged to elderly in the late 20th, early 21st century, only remember having, quote, heard something about it, or maybe seen a destroyed synagogue a day or two later. No one, as far as I'm aware, remembers going into the fray, standing there jeering at Jews, humiliating them, chanting the slogans that children were made to chant at that time. No one remembers taking stuff. Nobody remembers pocketing property. Nobody remembers that some of the things in their parents' house or the grandparents' house had formerly belonged to Jews. So there is a serious memory issue among those who are of the experienced generation, the people who lived through it, and their children and grandchildren. So that's one thing that needs raising to attention, embedding it in the wider history of what's going on across generations and in Germany. The second thing which I would like to conclude on in terms of how we can understand it today is to shift our attention a little bit away from the really important things that we have looked at, like anti-Semitism, radical activism, the obvious culprits, the SS, the SA, the Gestapo, the Hitler Youth and so on, and actually shift our attention to the wider society and the kinds of social relations which make it possible for us to not want to know, not want to see, to turn away, to turn a blind eye, and then to feel, well, we can't do anything anyway, can we, and not act. Because I think what Kristallnacht proved was that when it came to the Holocaust proper, under conditions of war, which I think Nick will talk about in a moment, it is, this was a warm-up act, if you like. This put people into a kind of practice of not seeing, not knowing. There are many, many detailed things we can take out of individual case studies in Kristallnacht itself. The fact that in small communities, when you knew the victims, you were more likely to go along with the perpetrators and act on the side of the perpetrators. In large cities where it's more anonymous, you were more likely to be able to remain passive and say, I'm ashamed, this is shocking, I'm ashamed to be German. So there are many things like that we can draw out as well. But I think it's very, very interesting to try and situate Kristallnacht in this wider social context of how could it come about, how was it possible to happen, and what longer-term consequences did it have, both immediately in the war years and much later, in terms of a German sense of being ashamed to be German, knowing that they'd been complicit in allowing these things to take place. Thank you.
Almost exactly where Mary left off, with this sense of Germany as a divided society, which doesn't have a clear consensus about a lot of things, including about anti-Semitism. It isn't clear-cut how Germans will react to the November pogrom. And for many years, historians thought that the overriding reaction was one of indifference, and that was largely drawn from what happened in the big cities, and was largely drawn from the reports collected by the social democratic underground reporters, smuggling reports out of Germany. And this creates two elements of bias. One is that the big cities of Hamburg, Berlin, and Frankfurt were the most secular parts of Germany, the ones where social democracy had had its largest influence, and where anti-Semitism pre-1933 had been weakest. And so it's not surprising that they increasingly became the place where German Jews lived, often had lived since at least the 19th century boom of urban centres. But they also distracted attention from what Mary was talking about, which is the conformity and the mobilization of people in small towns. And the German historian Michael Wirth, especially in the last 20 years, has drawn our attention back to this forgotten area which Social Democrats didn't have reporters in. Small towns in Franconia, like Treuchtlingen, not very far from Nuremberg, where the entire...
Could you use the microphone?
Of course I can.
Here, thank you.
Is this better?
Yes.
Good. So small towns in Franconia, not far from Nuremberg, like Treuchtlingen, where the entire mobilization of the November pogrom is a kind of popular festival, where, and as Mary said, the school children's presence, albeit often organized or enabled, is quite a key indicator, because one of the key things is that their parents let them go. And so wherever you have school children, you also have family cooperation. The state does not have control over children completely. It can't just do things without some degree of familial consent. And it's in those towns that we see something quite different. In the big cities, we see the looting, the violence, the burning down of synagogues, the taking of jewellery. So Heydrich is asked, as the head of the Gestapo and the SS, who's more or less organised this nationally. He's asked by Goering the next day to report about, on the 11th of November, to report in the Air Ministry about, how much property was destroyed and can they get any of these goods back again. He said, well, we can't really, it just went into their pockets. But the pattern in small towns is really quite different and much more horrifying, and rehearses a kind of theatre of ritual degradation, which will be meted out on Jews in Poland the following year. As soon as German forces go into Poland and then later into the Soviet Union, they start to mock and denigrate Jewish men especially, but also women and children, in public rituals of humiliation, which have been partly enacted through the 1930s as Nazi forms of popular spectacle to punish what they called Rassenschande, or the South African apartheid regime named miscegenation, relationships between Jewish men and so-called Aryan women. And the theatre of these kinds of humiliations is enacted also in big cities. So Saarbrücken, which has no particularly Nazi traditions pre-33, it's a centre of the Catholic labour movement. In November 1938, the Jewish men are rounded up and forced to form a marching column through the city, where one poor guy is in the lead with a drum strapped around his neck, and he has to beat the drum. They march them to the synagogue. They're forced to kneel in front of the synagogue and sing, and then to dance. And these rituals of forced singing, forced dancing, forced mock military parade are things which will be reenacted again and again in advance of the extreme violence and the killing actions in public places in and across Eastern Europe. And this is, in a sense, a premonition of a particular kind of future, which isn't to be seen in November 1938 in Berlin or Hamburg or Frankfurt. And this is why historians have disagreed quite fundamentally about how involved the German population is in Kristallnacht. The answer is it varies, and it varies according to geography, which is not about just small towns versus large cities. It's also voting patterns pre-1933, that areas which had supported anti-Semitic politics, especially Protestant areas or Protestant enclaves in overwhelmingly Catholic areas, of which Franconia is one, these are areas where anti-Semitism is the bread and butter of popular politics. It is a Volksfest, and the children do get involved. In big cities, where there's a much more secular and much more tolerant tradition, and from which many of the German Jews emigrating, including my father and his parents, came from Berlin, and he left in 1939. They still were in mourning in emigration for the other Germany, which they had lost. In my grandparents' case, it was steeped in a social-democratic secular culture, and in fact it was the local police chief who was a social-democratic appointment of the 1920s in Berlin, who told them when it was time to go and said, don't change your passports. So you have these very, very different memories that people take with them into emigration or not of the same country, because it is in fact still a divided country. And that's one of the really interesting things about German secret police reports on public opinion through the Second World War years is that they still capture this sense that there is a spectrum of opinion across this society which they've only superficially Nazified, but they're still reporting on what the old Labour movement areas say or what the old Catholic Centre Party voters say. And these are habits of mind and habits of association which haven't completely died. What I briefly want to sketch out is two different chronologies. I'm only taking this sense of retrospect forward 5 years. I'll stop in 1943, so we're not talking about a very long period of the last 80 years. We've still got 75 years left for discussion. But what I want to pick out are two contrasting chronologies. The first you'll probably be familiar with, which is essentially a German-Jewish chronology, which is that Kristallnacht is a turning point of persecution. It is the point where, as Mary said, if you hesitated about leaving, you knew you didn't have much choice afterwards, and if you could get out, you did get out, and the people who were left in September 1939 were overwhelmingly an old and impoverished German-Jewish community. And it was the young who did leave, one way or another. For them, 1938 is immediately followed by a series of forms of exclusion which Saul Friedlander and Marianne Kaplan have described as social death, the expropriation of property, the banning of all kinds of activities, the separation of Jews out of normal German society, and it's done administratively this time. And that will be the pattern of persecution within the Reich from here on in. If they learn one lesson, it's not to resort to street methods within Germany again. That will be reserved for the occupied territory. For German Jews who stayed, like Victor Klemperer, whose diaries I'm sure many of you have read, the pattern of persecution is minutely observed and minutely experienced, precisely because it's a form of exclusion from assimilated German society which he bitterly resents and flies in the face of all of his subjective sense of who he is. And some of these landmarks are very famous. So the introduction of the Jewish Star in 1941 in September is a universal landmark and immediately precedes the orders to start deporting German Jews in November and December 1941, a set of deportations which is more or less complete by spring 1943. And yet, for people like Klemperer, there are little forms of these apartheid regulations which bite home and which he never forgets. So in May 1941, I think it is, Jews are forbidden to keep pets anymore. And as a part of a childless couple, for him, giving up their cat is a very bitter blow. And this, if you read to the end of his wartime diaries, there's an almost farcical moment in May 1945 where he's finally liberated, he makes his way to Munich, and he is devastated by the city in which he studied as a graduate student and the amount of destruction which the wartime bombing has wrought on Munich. And he's trying to weigh it up in his moral sensibilities, and he realizes that for all of his passionate belief that Germany had to be defeated if he was to survive, there is a bit of a German nationalist still left in him when he sees the Americans driving around in their jeeps with their legs over the sides of the vehicles, and people like him being left in the swirling dusts in their wake. And he's weighing it up, and he makes the most ridiculous comment, which could only be true because it's so ridiculous. And he says, "Oh, good that they've all been paid back for everything they did to us." And his measure of everything they did to us is actually the loss of his cat. The phrase in the diary is not about somebody being killed, but the cat having to be put down. And you realize that this is the real stuff of an impossible moral accounting, that it is not possible for somebody in those circumstances to go through and imagine what the accounting really should be. So that's one chronology. The second chronology, which is what I really want to talk about if I've got any time left, is what one might call the German or non-Jewish chronology, which is, so when do people talk about Kristallnacht again? They don't do it when Nazi propaganda might make you think they should. Hitler makes his famous prophecy in January 1939 that which is the closest he ever gets to celebrating Kristallnacht in public, where he says that if the Jewish race should ever drive Europe into war again, then the result will not be the annihilation of the German people, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. And this famous prophecy of Hitler's is repeated again in the summer and autumn of 1941, and after the German declaration of war on the United States and the beginning of the final solution, it is used again and again, and increasingly concrete forms, where Vernichtung, with its abstraction about destruction, is replaced increasingly with Ausrottung or Ausmerzung, which can only mean annihilation. And sometimes the future tense is replaced by the past tense by 1942 and 1943. And so, as news and information ripple through German society about the mass deportations and murders of 1942, they don't actually provoke any public discussion. That moment comes in the summer and autumn of 1943, and it comes at a point and in a language where it is very clear that people know that the destruction of the Jews has largely been accomplished. It's about the past tense. And what people say is, if only we had not treated the Jews so badly, or if only we had not solved the Jewish question in such an extreme way, ... And the dots are about not the destruction of the Jews, but about the bombing of German cities. And the forced propulsion of this topic into public conversation is not... Sorry, that died.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that dies. We're doing well. The immediate cause of this conversation across Germany is the firebombing of Hamburg, which is the largest single destruction of a European city in the Second World War. 34,000 people are killed. The rumours circulating are of over 200,000 people having been killed. And it's followed by mass evacuations, not only from Hamburg, where 850,000 of its 1.2 million people leave, but from many, many other German cities. And in town after town, including places in the south, which are not bombed at all, like Bad Brückenau, which is west of Frankfurt, when they get evacuees from Frankfurt, they immediately start to compare what has happened in their city with what happened in 1938. Their point of reference is not the war, but it's Kristallnacht. And what people say is that it was retaliation to the nth degree for the Jewish action of 1938. Being rather literal-minded, people in Ochsenfurt wonder whether neighbouring Würzburg would be next. And some claim that it won't be because in Würzburg no synagogues were burned in 1938. And others say, after the city has been bombed, that the Yemen will come to Würzburg as soon as the last Jew has been deported from there. And it's this pattern of imagining that the bombing by the Allies is revenge and retaliation for the bombing of German cities, for the burning of synagogues in 1938, which creates a very, very interesting pattern of guilt, collusion, and public reflection, almost all of which is not wanted by the regime. It's a response to Goebbels' propaganda, which says that the Allied bombing is indeed organized by the Jews as an attempt to annihilate the German people, and it's used by the propaganda ministry and by all the media outlets to try and encourage Germans to fight the war to the last gasp. But what he gets back is this wave of criticism, if only we had not. This impossible wish to reverse something which you know is in the past has already happened. And it's given a local twist, which is that in one city after another, the burnt synagogues created vacant building plots in the centre of towns. And after the beginning of the air war in 1940, with the huge Luftwaffe raids on Britain, German cities start to build bunkers. And where do they build them? In Wetzlar, Braunschweig, Solingen, Frankfurt, Berlin, Siegen, Cologne, Emden, and Hamburg. they build them on the sites of the synagogues. And this gives a visual focal point to civil defense. It also gives a visual reminder when the cities are burned and churches are burning in Hamburg, that this is also where the synagogues are burned. And I think it's this involuntary reminder of what it is to see something deliberately set alight that also reminds Germans that although the regime told them always they were only reacting to Jewish aggression, in fact they were the ones who struck the first blow. Thank you.
We've heard tonight about the events of specifically Kristallnacht from a German perspective, focusing on Germany. And I'd like now to focus and turn our attention to the British response to those events, especially in respect to two unique groups of refugees. And in order to do that, we actually have to go back to the Anschluss, which we haven't talked about much. Mary alluded to it and to the shock that it was for Austrians. And I will say that in response to this event, there was a decided uptick in refugees to this country from Austria that was noted daily, almost daily in Parliament from March through April. And the response of the British government was rather unprecedented, and that was to require visas now for all arrivees from Germany and Austria, effective the beginning of May 1938. To put into human terms what Mary alluded to, here's a quote from a really remarkable document. It's a refugee named Dr. Lily Wagner. She wrote this in 1941. It's called Immigrants' Daily Life. It's held at the Wiener Library. And she wrote, she had set up some boarding houses for Jewish refugees herself. And in 1941, she was reflecting about the Viennese Jews when they arrived. And she said about them, without any warning, without any preparation, the unfortunate Viennese Jews were thrown out of their splendid villas and hunted out of the country, whereas the German Jews had had the chance to resign themselves to the changed circumstances and get used during all those years to the increasing difficulties and insults they had to encounter. The change in Austria had been too rapid to be fully understood. With the Anschluss came a wave of, it was really the turning point for Austrian Jews in terms of immigration, in the same way that later Kristallnacht will be for German Jews and those Austrians who haven't left by that point. You can see here from these statistics, and this is a particular group of Jews that I want to focus on, whereas up to the Anschluss, only a handful of German women had come to the UK to work as domestic servants as a way of getting out of Germany. After the Anschluss, you can see here, between the Anschluss and Kristallnacht, which is not very many months, just about 8-9 months, about 8,000 domestic service visas were issued by the UK. And then after Kristallnacht, between 12 and 14,000 refugee domestics arrived from Greater Germany. By the time the war broke out, 20,000 Jewish refugee women had come to England and taken jobs as live-in maids, nannies, cooks, and housekeepers. And one of these was Gertrude Lanshoff. Her papers are here at the Jewish Museum. It's including these photos. So she was a widow. Here she is with her husband and her sister. And I really thought this photo was so evocative because you can see hanging in the background, they're sitting on their own private balcony in Berlin, but there in the background is a swastika banner, which is like, they didn't notice it, I think, anymore. Another one of these women was Katie Kupferberg. Her papers are held at the Wiener Library. I've actually had them translated. That's a fascinating collection, and she wrote in a diary form to her family back in Leipzig. And here she is reflecting on her first few weeks in England. On Sundays when I was free, I walked about outdoors, but this didn't make me any happier. I walked down strange streets and heard the voices of strangers and thought about my loved ones and dear friends back home, feeling close to all of them and desperately alone here, so that suddenly a terrible wave of homesickness constricted my heart and I burst out in tears. I felt ashamed to be crying there out in the open, but I had nobody I could pour my heart out to. At least I felt some small relief after crying myself out. To add to my woes were the increasingly strenuous tasks I had to perform in the household and the constant nervous muddle caused by my madam. My current research project is to document these women's lives and experiences based on over 300 testimonies and memoirs that I have located. The examples I've shown here show that there are plentiful and rich sources for this work. The Jewish refugee domestics made up the largest single block of refugees who were admitted to this country to settle, and one of the few groups who were allowed, indeed required, to work. Yet there is not a single academic study devoted to them. They are virtually absent from public memory, scholarly accounts, and popular histories of the period. No monuments exist to their memory, and no events have ever been held to commemorate their rescue. I'd like to turn now to a frequently forgotten event of 1938, the expulsion of Polish Jews from Germany, October 29, 1938, known as the Poland Action. And this has a particular resonance, as you'll learn in a minute, about my own work. In the course of over 2 days, about 18 to 20,000 Polish Jews were deported without warning to the border of Poland and told to walk into Poland, among whom was this young man. Unfortunately, I had a segment of him describing that day when he came home from school. We couldn't get the sound to work, so I'll just briefly describe. It was the day after his 14th birthday. His father had been arrested. He had been sent home from school. He came back to find his mother, who had been in the middle of preparing the Shabbat meal. She was crying. His little 6-year-old brother didn't know what was going on. He said, "I tried to take charge," as a 14-year-old would. Eventually, they are picked up by the police in an open wagon. He remembers the late afternoon being cold and raining, and that the populace of their small town, Brambauer, had been alerted to the fact that the Jews of the town were being arrested, and they lined the streets and hurled abuse at them. The deportees were dumped, I'm just going to go back here, all along the border, but the majority of them ended up in the town of Zbąszyn, where they were held in a makeshift refugee camp by the Polish authorities, who were hoping to send them back to Germany. In this camp, here you can see a picture of some of these Jews being forced to walk across into Poland. You can see how they were dressed. They were just taken from their homes and the clothes on their backs. They were not allowed to take anything with them. You can see a Polish border guard. The Poles were completely taken by surprise by this event as well. They were given in Zbąszyn some military barracks, horse stalls to live in. You can see them here at the doorway, and also an abandoned flour mill where 6,000 to 8,000 people were poorly accommodated. In the horse stalls, along with Herbert Haberberg's family, was the family of Herschel Grünspan, whose shooting of the German diplomat von Rath was occasioned by his anger at the deportation of his family to Poland, and of course his act of revenge became the putative excuse for Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht itself caused a wave of public revulsion and sympathy in Britain, as nothing else preceding it had. And Parliament discussed it for the first time on November 14th, during which debate numerous MPs argued for a more generous refugee policy. The day after this debate, as this quote shows from the Home Secretary Samuel Hoare, Anglo-Jewish and other religious and humanitarian leaders met with the Prime Minister, and the case for urgent admission of children up to the age of 17 on the basis of education and training and ultimate re-immigration was made. Chamberlain was at first non-committal, but he took the idea to the full cabinet the following day, and Sir Samuel Hoare, who continued reluctant, was eventually persuaded to relax restrictions on trans migrants, including unaccompanied child refugees. A few days later, sometime after 9:30 p.m. on the 21st of November 1938, towards the end of a 2.5-hour House of Commons debate on racial, religious, and political minorities, the Home Secretary announced, in a mere 500 words that took but a few minutes to speak, the plan that would set in motion the most celebrated and mythologized refugee movement in modern British history, the Kindertransport. In the course of the long debate, though MP after MP begged the government to relax the Aliens Act and admit more refugees, Hoare made it clear that there was to be no large movement of refugees to the United Kingdom, Palestine, or the Dominions, and that only unaccompanied children could be dealt with, quote, in large numbers, provided they were sponsored by responsible bodies and responsible individuals. He says here, if the organizations told me they were prepared to bring all the children whose maintenance could be guaranteed either by their funds or by generous individuals, and that all will be necessary will be for the Home Office to give the necessary visas to facilitate their entry into this country. Here, he said, is the chance of taking the young generation of a great people. Here is the chance of mitigating to some extent the terrible sufferings of their parents and their friends. Though his sentiments were high-minded, in reality, his proposal saved the children while dooming their parents and families. He was not unaware of the controversies that a policy of welcoming children but not their families entailed. He used the phrase to some extent when outlining how his children's migration proposal might mitigate the terrible sufferings of their parents, and he acknowledged what a terrible dilemma it was to the Jewish parents in Germany to have to choose between sending their children to a foreign country into the unknown and continuing to live in the terrible conditions to which they were now reduced in Germany. However, he told the assembled members, he had received assurances from a Quaker relief worker that German Jewish parents were, quote, almost unanimously in favor of facing this parting with their children and taking the risks of their children going to a foreign country, that rather than keeping them with them to face the unknown dangers with which they are faced in Germany. Based upon such declarations, Hoare stated, we shall put no obstacle in the way of the children coming here. Although this information may have salved the lawmakers' consciences, they seemed oblivious to the reality that this terrible dilemma that was imposed on Jewish parents was imposed not by Germany, but by the English government. Hoare's sympathetic tone is belied by the harsh reality that after their children's rescue, the parents would continue to face the dangers to which he alluded. His words carried no hint that another option, allowing families to stay together, had ever been considered. The assumption that the British government had no other choice than to bring unaccompanied children to England was reinforced in later public discussion of the Kindertransport. The first children arrived on the 2nd of December 1938, and by the time the war was declared, about 10,000 had made it to safety in the United Kingdom. In the years since its enactment, the Kindertransport has been widely mischaracterized as a government-sponsored scheme, though in fact Samuel Hoare made it quite clear that the government's role would be limited to some slight exceptions in immigration controls. In the past 80 years, the Kindertransport has also become enclosed within a simplified narrative of rescue and salvation, which was first articulated in 1944. It is not a small thing in these years of suffering without parallel to have given 10,000 children the opportunity to grow up in an atmosphere of decency and normality, to work, to play, to laugh and be happy, and to assume their rightful heritage as free men and women. And this narrative has been echoed down through the years, as you can see in this statement of the Emeritus Chief Rabbi in September of 2015, when the crisis of the Syrian refugees was at its apogee. The last few days have brought back images that we thought we would never see again. They take our mind way back to the Holocaust, and it is important to remember simple humanitarian gestures like the Kindertransport, which rescued 10,000 children and lit a light in the darkest period of history. The 80th anniversary of the movement is a good time for engaging in a reevaluation of its origins, operations, and outcomes, and a critical examination of the distortions and mythologies that have grown up around its celebration, commemoration, and retelling. My own work in the past 10 years has been focused on just that, culminating in my book, The Kindertransport, Contesting Memory, coming out next year. It is based upon archival material that I located at the University of Southampton, specifically the case files of over 200 Kindertransportees cared for by the Refugee Children's Movement, the West London Synagogue, and the 154 children brought out of Sponsion by a small organization known as the Polish Jewish Refugee Fund. Here is the first group of those children arriving. They came on a ship that sailed right up the Thames and docked at London Bridge. These files include correspondence among a number of refugee organizations, with foster parents and other carers, from children's parents and families, and from the children themselves. What has emerged from this research is that reducing the Kindertransport to a simple tale of rescue and salvation does an enormous disservice to the lived experiences of Kindertransportees, which were varied and complex, as many Kinder have struggled to express in the thousands of testimonies and memoirs that memorialize their lives. Though many wished to tell the full story of their experiences, both then and now, imperatives of gratitude often held them back, as these excerpts attest. The first is from one of the Sponsion Kinder, who believed that her very life depended on not telling her truth to the refugee authorities. I was the most miserable child in the world, but I was ashamed to say I was homesick. I thought they'd throw me out if I showed any lack of appreciation for my good fortune, quote, unquote. And these from the memoirs of two Kinder who had very difficult lives as refugees, one with an emotionally abusive foster mother, another in a hostel where her emotional needs were not met. I still haven't recovered from the need to apologize for daring to complain. We were saved. How dare we criticize anything? It goes very deep, and we lost our confidence in being allowed to have feelings or opinions at all. And in the countries where many victims had sought refuge, they found that no one wanted to hear their suffering. Though some children found loving homes, many found indifference or were mistreated. Alienated from Judaism, exploited, and abused, many had to struggle to reach their vocational aspirations, and many never did. And nearly all were traumatized by the separation from their families, separations which for the majority were permanent. In testimony after testimony, it becomes clear that these traumas lasted lifetimes. This is another one of the Sponsion Kinder, who noted that although I was lucky enough not to go into a concentration camp, my life wasn't easy. She was sexually abused in one of her foster homes. Another one was emotionally abusive. It's worse now than it was years ago. I don't know why. I can't shake it. When I was young, I was able to say I have my children. We work to build a life, to build a home. You build and you build. And then when you're older, there's nothing to build. And all the things that were there in the back of your mind are somehow in the front. And I can't shake it. I can't. And to conclude with a quote by Ruth David, I did not myself live through the worst horrors of the Holocaust had to offer. I did, however, have more experience of grief and pain, of loss and deprivation, of humiliation, despair, and abandonment that any child should have to face. I still cannot speak of my parents or of their fate without losing control. Going forward, how should the Kindertransport be remembered and commemorated? Certainly it is right for Kinder and their families to feel enormous gratitude for having their lives and the lives of their loved ones spared when so many others were lost. There is no necessity, however, for a binary choice between two competing narratives about the Kindertransport. Gratitude for the willingness of the British government to allow refugee organizations to bring 10,000 children out of Nazi lands, and for the efforts of those organizations and numerous ordinary citizens to take those children in and care for them, can coexist with a truthful examination of the immigration policies that enabled them to come, and of their reception and treatment after they arrived, even when those truths are painful and difficult. The fact that these children's lives were saved should not serve as a roadblock to the frank investigation of their refugee experiences. And such an exploration is not meant to cast blame or to paint the entire enterprise as a failure, but to bring into the light its complicated and challenging realities. Thank you.